I stand before you today as Ezra Clark, and I want to thank you for being here to celebrate my almost 200th birthday, November 23rd. In thinking about what I might say of value to supplement, if not complement, my own testimony, I thought it might be interesting to hear some of my youth and early adulthood to give you a sense of how I arrived at the values I had as I wrote that testimony at the end of my life. In doing so, I would call you to the prairie of southern Illinois. In 1818, my father moved there with his family from Indiana and was the first landowner of the property to which he was assigned in what later became Edwards County in southern Illinois. That happened to be the 6th property my father had owned as a new settler and as a first landowner at that point in his life. I was born in a log cabin on the prairies of southern Illinois. I soon learned the skills of surviving, working with cattle and horses and shooting wildlife to survive. Within my first year of birth, my sister Myra was married to John Sargent and then left. And after about a year or so, we never knew any more whatever happened to her. When I was about a year and a half old, my older sister Laura was married to Morris Phelps. Morris Phelps had been visiting his Kniep family in southern Illinois on the prairie, and the Knieps had moved from near Kirtland, Ohio. And Morris came and dated my sister and were married when I was about a year and a half old, so I didn't know her very well either. And then about that same time, my father fell under the spell, I will call it a spell, under the great influence of a Methodist preacher called Jesse Walker. And much of the rest of the next 10 or 12 years of my life can be attributed to Jesse Walker, because within about a year and a half of her marriage, we moved again. We moved to the area just east of Peoria on the banks of the Illinois River in Tazewell County. There we stayed for about a year, but in the meantime acquired the friendship of Sanford Porter, Hosea Stout, and Charles C. Rich. And some of you may appreciate particularly that Charles C. Rich connection, as well as my two brothers-in-law by then, Morris Phelps and John Cooper, becoming business partners with Sanford Porter. My father seemed to have an itch about things, so we moved again, farther north in Illinois to LaSalle County. By then I was a young man, young toddler, and I remember walking behind the wagon the 60 or 70 miles north as we went to LaSalle County, Rutland Township, where we remained for a year. My father started a sawmill on the creek, and about a year later, John Green from Ohio came by and wanted to buy the property, so my father said, yes, we can do that, because in the meantime, Reverend Walker had suggested that there was a greater opportunity to spread Methodism in northern Illinois. So in 1829, we moved to Walker's Grove, which is now Plainfield near Joliet, Illinois, and settled near the banks of the DuPage River. One of the many interesting things in my life then is I was entering close to teenagehood, but not quite, having a relationship with the Potawatomi Indians. And after several years of living in that property, my father again had the urge to leave because it was becoming crowded. People were moving in from New England and the southern states, and he just felt crowded. However, before we moved, a very significant thing happened to us. We had these missionaries arrive one day in the community in July, and they were purporting to represent a new prophet, a new religion. And it was called the Church of Jesus Christ, or the nickname in those days was Mormonites. And the Mormonites gave lessons to my family, my neighbors and friends, and in fact, my sister Laura and her husband were converted. And by the time Lyman White and John Curill left the area, they had baptized Mr. Barry, James Emmett, who later became associated with Sanford Porter, and had baptized my brother-in-law Morris Phelps and his wife Laura, my sister. They followed them to Missouri. In the meantime, those two missionaries, those Mormonites, stopped in Tazewell County by Peoria, where we once lived, and talked to Charles Rich and Hosea Stout and Jonathan Sumner and Sanford Porter. And after 2 weeks, Sanford Porter accepted the gospel and agreed to follow them and go with them all to Missouri. So by the time I was 11 years old, one of my sisters, who had married in Indiana, whom I never knew, my other sister, Myra, and her husband had drowned in Louisiana, and my sister Laura went to Missouri, and then my oldest sister Rhoda, with John Cooper as husband, was still there. In 1832, John Cooper, with his brothers-in-law, my brothers, David Keeler and Barrett Bassett, and Dad, served for a short time in the Black Hawk War. They didn't do a lot, but they were part of a support organization that made that skirmish possible. So early on, I learned the value of work. I learned the value of family. I learned the value of friends, and I began to appreciate the fact that freedoms came from standing for something and being patriotic. In 1835, and I don't know what the motivation was especially, but I think it was because my mother missed her 2 daughters with children in Missouri. So in 1835, in September, my father moved again. This time we made quite the move. We journeyed from where we were in northern Illinois, 200 miles south to Peoria area, stayed over the weekend with Charles C. Rich. By then, he'd had experience with Zion's Camp, so he knew how to get to Missouri. So he taught us the route to go to Missouri. We followed that route and arrived near Excelsior Springs, Missouri, near a farm owned then by John Cooper. Now, if you know your Zion's Camp history, you'll know that John Cooper's farm is the place where Zion's Camp was disbanded in Clay County. So we moved there, and Father acquired some property, and we began to do what we'd done before. Till the soil, build corrals, have barns, have animals, have fruit trees, and have vegetable gardens. As you can see, I began to develop early the notion of industry and enterprise and being responsible and taking charge and knowing what your neighbors and friends are doing. Soon after we moved there, the persecution of the saints in Clay County increased to the point where the legislature appointed Caldwell County as a haven for members of the church. So we moved to Caldwell County. But before we did that, one of my older brothers, whom I greatly revered, William Oglesby Clark, baptized me in Fishing River in 1836 when I was 12 years old. We then moved to Caldwell County, about 1.5 miles from Far West Temple site. There we went through the vagaries of being persecuted by the Missouri militia, and again developed orchards, farms, animal husbandry, and had a good life for a while. Unfortunately, things increased to the point where the governor issued an extermination order saying that all of the saints should leave. In the meantime, the Missouri militia had plundered our farm, taken some of our animals, taken my father to prison for a day or two apparently, but released him because he was older. And we experienced all of that persecution that all those saints experienced, and here I am just a young teenager. The winter of 1838 and 1839 was a very, very severe winter in Missouri. Early in October, it began to snow and be cold, and things were frozen. I think it was because of that my mother's health deteriorated to the point where in February of 1839 she passed away. She passed away while my older brother, Hero, William Oglesby, was away on a mission. He came back in time to attend her funeral. Her funeral sermon was preached by a new apostle, John Page, and then she was buried in the Far West Burial Ground. By February, many of the saints had left and returned to Illinois, first of all arriving in Quincy, as many of you know, and being hosted in the hospital, tended to by the people in Quincy. Our family lingered because Morris Phelps was in prison, and I helped my sister Laura help take care of him for a while. And in fact, I think our family was one of the few families left, so that on April 25th, when the apostles came back into Missouri by the dead of night and appeared at the temple site at 1 o'clock in the morning on April 26th, we were there to host them. In fact, my older brother John Wesley owned a piece of property kitty corner to the temple lot. Although the records are not clear, I think it was there where we hosted the apostles for breakfast, as Heber C. Kimball said. We had a great breakfast. The apostles then left, and by dawn, the Missourians who knew they were coming and were looking for them were totally confused because they could not find who they were looking for. We'd helped them on their way. Soon thereafter, we also packed up and began our trek across Missouri to Quincy, Illinois. Many of you have heard that as a 12 or 13-year-old, I herded the cattle across the state. Yeah, I did help, but I had 3 older brothers helping, as well as John Murdoch. John Murdoch was from the family of John Murdoch, whose wife died in the birth of twins, and whose twins were taken care of by the prophet and Emma. So I had that connection early on to that family. We too arrived in Quincy, Illinois for several weeks, eventually journeyed up to the Iowa Territory and landed in a place called Charleston. According to the 1840 census, our next door neighbor was Wilford Woodruff. Now, as a young teenager, I had met Wilford Woodruff at the temple site, even though I was too young to go out there myself. I had 2 older brothers go to the temple site with the apostles. Our neighbors were the Woodruffs, the Smoots, the Stevensons, and other families that I remember well. In fact, as has been referred to, later on when the state settled Nauvoo, my friends and I would row across the Mississippi River to listen to the prophet. We did it very often. And one of those became a very dear friend, Edward Stevenson. In fact, I liked the whole family, so I married one of the girls, Mary Stevenson, in 1845. And then the other one was Nathan Porter, whose account of our meeting them in 1828 and helping them journey to Tazewell County is well documented by Nathan Porter's journal. But I'd like you to know that in these experiences, I always admire my family's devotion to God. Early on in the arrival in Ohio, my father became a Methodist, a class leader, where in Connecticut he had probably been a Congregationalist. But since his days in Ohio and then in Illinois, in many places, we followed faithfully the Methodist religion. So when missionaries came, they were not talking to an empty vessel. He knew the religion, he knew the Bible, and he was willing to accept a greater truth. I had the same experience as I matured in Nauvoo. And I appreciated the fact that I had friends, I had family connections, even though my mother was gone. I still had brothers, I still had a couple of married sisters in the area as well. My sister Laura died in 1842, several years after she'd gone to the Columbia, Missouri jail to rescue her husband, Morris Phelps, from prison. And that account is written in the Parley P. Pratt autobiography because she helped rescue Parley P. Pratt, as well as Lewin Gibbs and King Follett. All very interesting, but all very instructive for me as a young man to learn about the value of friendship, about faith, about highly regarding things that are important to you. In 1845, I married my sweetheart, Mary Stevenson. The marriage ceremony was performed by my hero older brother, William Oglesby Clark. But then in 1846, on the first day of the year, I'm happy to report that my father and my brothers-in-law and I went to the Nauvoo Temple and were sealed to our spouses. And that was a great day for us. Soon thereafter, Brigham had advised the saints to leave Nauvoo because of increasing persecution. So we, along with them, began to prepare to do that. In 1846, we crossed and slogged through muddy, rainy, cold Iowa and arrived on the shores of the Missouri River in what later became known as winter quarters. Being a very firm believer in the faith, as you've heard me declare in my testimony, I took the counsel of Brigham Young and remained in winter quarters for a year before I decided to come out to the territory of Utah. Now, I've given you a little glimpse of what my life was like early on. I know that we could go on for a long time, but then we would all have to talk about different things we know of Ezra Thompson Clark, the mature, faithful follower of the prophet and of the apostles living here in Farmington and Utah. I would like to suggest that if you want to know more about my life as Ezra Thompson Clark, Do you read this book? If you don't have one, get one. If you can't get one, borrow one. Do we have any left, Kelly?
Not here.
No.
It's a download too.
It's downloadable.
I think it's free.
If you want to know a lot more about my life as a youth and my father's life, then read this book. And if you don't have one, I know they're available. I know I have two. Speaking now of me, if you want to know about my ancestors, get this book. Second edition.
We have a bunch here today if you need one. Yep, we have several hundred of the green books if you need them.
It's sunk cost, so any contribution would be a help. If you want to know about my life as a father, written by the hand of a daughter, read this book, as well as Edward Barrett's history that I see on the back table. Any questions? Lauren, you're smiling. Thank you all very much.